you've given us a really fascinating stack of sources here. Articles, investigative reports, and, well, even claims from people who were incredibly close to one of music history's most towering figures.
Yeah, we're talking about the Godfather of soul, James Brown.
Exactly.
And our mission here, really, is to explore what these materials tell us about the persistent questions and, frankly, some pretty strange circumstances surrounding his death back in 2006.
So we're diving into the details, right? The official story, the doubts that popped up almost immediately, and this recent push for authorities to maybe take another look.
That's it. And crucially, we're basing this only on what these sources you've brought us contain.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What was initially reported? James Brown passed away Christmas Day 2006, Emory University Hospital, Midtown in Atlanta.
Right. And the official cause of death, as it's stated in these sources anyway, was listed as a heart attack and fluid in the lungs. Basically, congestive heart failure made worse by pneumonia. He was 73.
Okay. But this is where it starts getting complicated, isn't it? According to these sources.
Yeah, right away.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most striking details is about the physician who's actually with him during his final hours. The one who signed the death certificate, Dr. Marvin Crawford.
Yeah. What about him?
Well, the sources say he had profound doubts, like lasting doubts.
Profound doubts. What specifically did Dr. Crawford note? What made him doubt?
Well, he's quoted saying he always wondered what went wrong in that room. He found it puzzling because, he said, Brown changed too fast.
Changed too fast.
Yeah. In fact, he said Brown was a patient he would never have predicted would have coded.
Coded, meaning his heart stopped, medically speaking.
Exactly. And Dr. Crawford, according to these sources, even suggested it was possible, maybe, that Brown's death could have been caused by some kind of toxic substance.
Wow. So he actually suspected something like poison?
Yeah, he considered it, yeah. Recommended an autopsy, to be sure. But the sources mentioned that Brown's daughter, Yama Brown, declined that request at the time.
Okay, so the doctor on the scene has serious questions, even thinks about foul play, suggests the standard procedure in autopsy, but it doesn't happen.
Right. So literally at the moment of death, the medical professional directly involved has this significant uncertainty. That detail alone, presented so early in the narrative these sources build, is...
Well, that's pretty telling.
It really sets a tone, doesn't it? Okay, so fast forward over a decade. These lingering questions, they found a new champion, right? Which led to the recent activity highlighted in these sources.
And that brings us to Jacque Hollander. She's described as a circus singer and a former collaborator of Brown's.
Okay.
And she has been very, very public with her claims that James Brown was murdered. And crucially, she took her claims, along with what she presented as evidence, directly to the Fulton County District Attorney, Paul Howard Jr.
Right. I remember reading that in the sources. They give some detail about that meeting with D.A. Howard.
They do. She apparently shared her belief that not only James Brown, but also his third wife, Adrienne Brown, were murdered.
Both of them. That was her claim. The sources describe her coming prepared, with a witness list, printouts of text messages, and kind of memorably, this green plastic bin, she said, was full of her perceived evidence.
A green plastic bin. That's such a specific detail, almost cinematic, like you said, sticks with you.
Yeah, and this wasn't just like a casual meeting. The sources indicate the DA's office took it seriously enough to actually dispatch investigators.
Really? So they started looking into it.
That's what the sources state. Investigators were sent out to begin conducting interviews, evaluating all the information Hollander presented. The whole purpose was to figure out if a full-scale death investigation should be formally launched.
So her claims, as presented in these sources, they directly led to this re-examination by authorities years later. But how widespread were these doubts, really? Was it just Hollander pushing this?
Oh, far from it. Not according to these materials, anyway. One source mentions a CNN investigative series, which was actually spurred by Hollander's claims initially.
Okay.
And that series published the names of 13 people connected to Brown who either wanted an autopsy performed or believed a criminal investigation was necessary.
13 people. Wow, that's a significant number. Who are some of these people? Are they named in the sources?
Yeah, some are. The sources list his widow, Tomie Ray Brown, his son, Darrell Brown, his longtime manager, Charles Bobbitt, and even civil rights activist Al Sharpton, who was a close friend.
So people really close to him, inner circle.
Absolutely. People undeniably close to James Brown in different ways, all expressing questions.
Yeah.
And the sources also note that his daughter LaRonda Pettit and his son-in-law, Darren Lumar, also publicly contended Brown was murdered.
Right.
Though it's important to note both of them passed away themselves before this recent push for investigation that the sources focus on.
That adds a whole other layer, doesn't it? So the suspicion wasn't just one person on the fringes. It was family, manager, close associates, spread across different relationships and times. Okay, given that context, let's maybe look closer at some of the specific kind of strange details about his final days in the hospital that these sources highlight.
Right. These details seem to come largely from accounts like Dr. Crawford's and others who were there. So Brown was admitted on December 23rd. The symptoms the sources describe sound consistent with early congestive heart failure and maybe signs of a mild heart attack.
Okay, seems fairly standard, medically speaking, for someone his age.
Initially, yes. But here's a notable detail the sources mentioned right at admission. His urine tested positive for cocaine.
Cocaine. Okay, that's not typically associated with the heart failure or pneumonia explanation, is it? Not in the way the official cause was first put out there.
Not directly, no. But Dr. Crawford is quoted as saying that after getting initial treatment, oxygen IV fluids for the congestion, medication Brown actually improved fast.
Improved fast.
Yeah. Crawford apparently felt he probably could have walked out of the hospital if he wanted by Christmas Eve. The doctor left for the night feeling Brown was stable.
Okay, so he seemed to be getting better, but then things took a sudden turn, didn't they?
A very sudden turn. Dr. Crawford got a call late that night, Christmas night, saying Brown's heart had stopped. By the time Crawford got back to the hospital, Brown was gone.
Oh, wow.
And this is where the sources introduce some particularly unusual accounts from other people who were there.
Like Andre Moses White? Was he mentioned?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Andre Moses White, described as a friend who helped Brown check into the hospital. He was reportedly there that night along with the manager, Charles Bobbitt, and an assistant, David Washington.
Okay, so what did White say?
Well, White's account, as it's told in these sources, is based on what he says a nurse told them. White claims Bobbitt and Washington left Brown alone for a period.
Left him alone in the hospital room?
For a time, yeah. And during that time, according to the nurse White says he spoke with, Brown had been visited by a male stranger.
A male stranger. An unknown person just visiting James Brown's hospital room on Christmas night.
That's the detail presented in the sources, yeah. And crucially, White claims the nurse said that after this visit from the stranger, Brown's vital signs just rapidly declined.
So the timing. It's presented as highly suspicious in these accounts. Stranger visits, then Brown crashes.
That's how it's laid out. And it gets even more specific.
More specific. How?
White further claimed that this same nurse pointed out apparent drug residue in Brown's endotracheal tube.
The breathing tube.
Yeah, the tube they insert into the windpipe to help a patient breathe when they're critically ill. And according to White's account in these sources, she actually drew a vial of Brown's blood from his IV line and gave it to White.
She gave the friend a vial of blood.
Told him to get it tested. That's the claim in the sources.
So just to recap what the sources claim. A friend walks out of the hospital with a vial of James Brown's blood, given to him by a nurse who allegedly saw drug residue and noted a mysterious visitor just before a rapid decline. That's quite a narrative presented in these materials.
It certainly is. And the sources then go on to connect this back to Dr. Crawford's thinking later on. Apparently, after speaking with White, the doctor came to believe that Brown had somehow willingly taken illegal drugs while in the hospital and died of an accidental overdose.
Okay, so the doctor's initial suspicion, the toxic substance idea, it shifted more towards an accidental overdose after hearing these accounts from White.
That seems to be the progression described in the sources, yes. But here's another twist.
There's more.
These same sources claim that James Brown's accountant, a guy named David Cannon, insisted that Dr. Crawford keep that overdose information private.
Wait, the accountant? Urging the doctor to keep quiet about the suspected cause of death? If that's true, according to these sources, that adds a huge element of potential obstruction, maybe even cover-up to the whole story.
It absolutely adds another layer of complexity and suspicion to the narrative the sources present. And they also mention that Dr. Crawford at one point contacted a retired homicide detective about his concerns, Vincent Velasquez.
Okay. And what was the result of that contact, according to the sources?
Well, Velasquez is quoted stating that the Atlanta police declined to investigate Brown's death.
Declined? Why?
Their reported reasoning, as quoted directly in the sources, was pretty stark. It's not murder if someone gave somebody cocaine.
Huh. So, based on that quote in the sources, The police view seems to have been that if cocaine was involved, even if someone else gave it to him, they didn't see it as a crime needing a homicide investigation at that time, at least not based on what they knew then.
It seems that way. That decision point is pretty critical in understanding why the case didn't go further officially back then.
Yeah, it highlights a potential legal interpretation that, according to these sources, effectively shut down an official investigation, despite the doctor's own doubts and all these strange details coming out.
Exactly. But the unsettling circumstances aren't just confined to James Brown's final hours. The sources also draw connections to other suspicious deaths surrounding the Brown family.
Right, you mentioned his ex-wife Adrienne and his son-in-law Darren Lumar earlier.
Yes. The sources present the circumstances of Brown's death as having these sort of eerie similarities to Adrienne's death, which happened a decade earlier, back in 1996.
Adrienne, she was the one who had accused Brown of domestic abuse, right?
That's mentioned in the sources, yes. And reportedly, she told her divorce attorney just days before her death that she feared for her life.
Wow. And what was the official cause of her death?
Officially, the Brown family stated she died of complications following cosmetic surgery.
Okay.
However, the sources reveal that a retired police detective who'd investigated her death later found a notebook from an informant.
An informant's notebook, what was in it?
It contained an allegation that a doctor confessed to murdering Adrienne Brown via drug overdose, staged to look like complications from the surgery.
Whoa. An alleged confession. To murder via overdose, made to look like something else.
That's the allegation presented. Now, the sources do note the unnamed doctor denied these specific allegations, and no charges were ever filed in Adrienne's case. But the similarity in the alleged method overdose, staged as something else, is a parallel drawn explicitly in these sources, linking it back to the potential overdose theory in James Brown's own case.
That's a powerful parallel, even if unproven, that the sources are highlighting.
It is. And then there's the unsolved murder of his son-in-law, Darren Lumar, in 2008. Lumar was married to Brown's daughter, Yama.
Okay.
The sources highlight that Lumar had actually gone public on local TV news back in 2007, so less than a year after Brown's death, contending that James Brown was murdered.
So someone close to the family publicly says James Brown was murdered, and then he himself is murdered.
That's the sequence presented. The sources note that just about a year after making those public statements, Darren Lumar was killed in Atlanta, and his murder, according to these materials, remains unsolved.
That sequence of events, I mean, the ex-wife's suspicious death with an alleged overdose plot, then years later, the son-in-law's unsolved murder right after he claims Brown was killed, that creates a really heavy cloud around the family history, doesn't it, as presented in these sources?
It certainly suggests a pattern, or at least an environment, where foul play might not have been an isolated event, adds layers of potential motive, potential risk, and just unresolved questions that go beyond James Brown himself, all highlighted by the sources as contributing to the overall mystery.
Yeah. And adding to this whole picture of unresolved issues, even the location of James Brown's final burial place is reportedly a point of contention among family members mentioned in these sources.
Yeah, it's another strange detail. One source mentions that while his body is widely believed to be interred in a crypt on the property of his daughter, Deanna Brown Thomas,
Okay.
another daughter, LaRonda, before she passed away, reportedly disputed this, claimed that wasn't the case. And when CNN reportedly asked Deanna about the location and these allegations that the crypt might be empty, she apparently refused to comment.
Refused to comment. So years later, with all these questions swirling, all these suspicious details, these allegations, even the basic fact of where his body lies is debated among his own family, according to these sources. That's remarkable.
It really underscores the deep level of unresolved issues surrounding his death and his legacy. And so as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into your sources, they tell us that the Fulton County DA's office was, at the time these reports were written, set to make a decision within months.
A decision on what?
On whether a formal, full investigation into James Brown's death would finally be warranted based on everything presented by Hollander and whatever their investigators found.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the key points these sources have brought out in our deep dive. Official cause of death: heart attack, fluid in the lungs.
But the signing doctor, Dr. Crawford, had immediate significant doubts. Noted how rapidly Brown declined, even initially suggested a possible toxic substance.
Right. Then years later, Jacque Hollander brings forward murder claims, presents supposed evidence to a prosecutor, which leads to the DA's office evaluating a reexamination.
And these sources indicate lots of other people close to Brown family, manager, friends, also expressed doubts or flat out stated they believe he was murdered.
We heard about specific, very strange details from the hospital: the positive cocaine test on admission, the reported visit from an unknown male stranger right before his vital signs crashed.
And those claims of apparent drug residue found later, plus the vial of blood supposedly given to his friend.
Then there are those unsettling connections the sources draw to his ex-wife Adrian's suspicious death in '96, with those allegations of a staged overdose.
And the unsolved murder of his son-in-law, Darren Lumar, in 2008, who had publicly claimed James Brown was murdered just the year before he himself was killed.
And finally, even the location of his final resting place is apparently a point of contention among some family members mentioned in these sources.
And all of this led to that prosecutor evaluating whether a full investigation is warranted.
Okay.
So considering the sheer volume of questions, the conflicting accounts, the strange details, these interconnected suspicious deaths highlighted in these sources, years after the fact, it really makes you wonder, what does it truly take for a case like this, involving such a famous figure with so many complex, lingering questions, to finally get to the bottom of what happened?
Yeah, that's the provocative thought these sources really leave us wrestling with, isn't it?
It is.
Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you for bringing these compelling sources to our deep dive today.
Always a pleasure to explore the depths of these complex stories with you.
See you next time.